October 21st, 1942, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Corporal Eugene Sledge pressed another clip into his M1 Garand rifle as Japanese infantry emerged from the tree line 500 yards distant. Behind him, stacked ammunition crates reached shoulder height, 30 caliber rounds in their thousands, mortar shells arranged in neat pyramids, grenades packed in wooden boxes that seemed to multiply overnight. The supply sergeant had told him to take what he needed. Take more than that. Take enough to feel confident. Across the Lunga River perimeter, Imperial Japanese Army Lieutenant Yoshio Nakamura watched through field glasses as American positions erupted with sustained fire. His own men had received 30 rounds per rifleman that morning, 30 bullets to hold their sector against what appeared to be endless American ammunition. The resupply convoy from Rabaul had been sunk 3 days earlier. Another would not arrive for a week, if it arrived at all. His orders were to conserve ammunition. Fire only when targets presented themselves at close range, make every shot count, because there would be no more. The war that military strategists had predicted would be decided by superior tactics and training was revealing itself to be something else entirely. A contest of industrial capacity measured in brass casings and powder charges. The side that could deliver more bullets to more rifles would write the terms of victory, regardless of how brave their opponents fought. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The morning of August 7th, 1942 brought the 1st Marine Division ashore at Guadalcanal's Lunga Point, with expectations shaped by training exercises conducted thousands of miles from actual combat. Each rifleman carried 88 rounds of 30 caliber ammunition in his cartridge belt and weapon. An additional 48 rounds hung in a cloth bandolier across his torso, 136 bullets total. Military planners had calculated this as sufficient for initial contact, with resupply operations established within hours of securing the beachhead. What distinguished American ammunition logistics from every previous military operation in history was not the quantity each individual soldier carried, but the system designed to continuously replenish that supply without interruption. Landing craft that had delivered Marines to the beach immediately returned to offshore vessels to collect ammunition pallets. Shore parties established ammunition supply points within rifle range of the front lines. Forward observers could request fire support, knowing that artillery batteries possessed thousands of rounds in reserve, with more arriving daily from supply bases across the Pacific. Eugene Sledge, who would later write one of the most detailed memoirs of Pacific warfare, observed the ammunition distribution system with the practiced eye of an infantryman whose survival depended on understanding logistics. Each Marine company maintained its own ammunition dump, supplied by battalion reserves, which drew from regimental stockpiles, which connected to division supply points that received continuous deliveries from offshore vessels. The system functioned like nested backup generators, each level ensuring that temporary shortages at forward positions never translated into actual deprivation. The M1 Garand rifle that Sledge carried represented American industrial capacity expressed through precision manufacturing. John Garand's design had been standardized in 1936, giving American industry 6 years to refine production before combat requirements demanded maximum output. By 1942, factories were producing Garands at rates that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. Springfield, Armory, and Winchester together manufactured over 4 million units during the war years, creating supply chains that ensured every Marine received not just one rifle, but access to replacement weapons if his became damaged or lost. The ammunition those rifles consumed required even more elaborate industrial coordination. Each 30 caliber cartridge began as raw copper and brass ore extracted from mines in Arizona and Montana, shipped to processing facilities where it was refined and shaped into individual casings. Lead for bullets came from separate mining operations. Powder production required chemical facilities operating under strict quality control to ensure consistent propellant characteristics. Primers involved their own specialized manufacturing processes. All these components converged at ammunition plants, where workers assembled roughly 10 million rounds per day at peak production. American military planners understood that infantry combat in the Pacific would consume ammunition at rates unprecedented in previous conflicts. Jungle terrain limited visibility and created situations where Marines engaged targets at close range without clear fields of fire. Defensive positions required sustained suppressive fire to keep enemy forces pinned while maneuver elements flanked their locations. Night combat, common throughout the Pacific campaign, meant firing at sounds rather than visible targets, dramatically increasing ammunition expenditure per enemy casualty. The planning documents that guided Guadalcanal logistics reflected these realities through calculations that shocked officers trained in more conservative traditions. A Marine rifle company engaged in sustained combat was expected to consume approximately 2,000 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition per day. A battalion conducting offensive operations might fire 20,000 rounds in a single engagement. Artillery batteries supporting infantry advances could expend 500 shells in an afternoon of coordinated fire missions. These were not exceptional circumstances, but baseline assumptions that determined how much ammunition had to be continuously flowing toward Guadalcanal. Behind the front lines, supply officers managed inventories that would have required entire warehouses in previous wars. The 1st Marine Division's organic supply trains carried sufficient ammunition for approximately 5 days of sustained combat. Division supply dumps ashore at Guadalcanal maintained reserves for another 10 days. Ships anchored offshore held additional stocks for another week beyond that. The entire system was designed with redundancy that assumed significant losses to Japanese air attacks, allowing the logistics chain to absorb damage while continuing to function. Lieutenant Yoshio Nakamura's situation reflected entirely different planning assumptions and industrial realities. Imperial Japanese Army logistics had been designed for campaigns in China, where distances from supply bases were measured in hundreds rather than thousands of miles. The success of early Pacific operations from Pearl Harbor through Singapore had created confidence that captured supplies would supplement Japanese stocks, reducing the burden on home production facilities. Guadalcanal shattered those assumptions immediately. The island sat at the extreme end of supply lines, stretching back to Rabaul, which itself depended on shipments from Japanese home islands across vast Pacific distances. Every round of ammunition delivered to Nakamura's position required transportation by ships that American submarines and aircraft increasingly targeted. The original Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal had been construction workers building an airfield, not combat troops preparing for extended defensive operations. They possessed minimal ammunition stocks when Marines landed. Japanese reinforcements arrived by destroyer in fast night runs that American forces nicknamed the Tokyo Express. These operations prioritized delivering troops over supplies, creating situations where fresh infantry reached Guadalcanal with limited ammunition and no prospect of resupply beyond what they carried. Nakamura's battalion had disembarked with 200 rounds per rifleman, considered generous by Japanese standards. That initial supply had been depleted through a series of unsuccessful attacks on Marine positions, reducing his men to carefully husbanded reserves that made aggressive operations impossible. The contrast became most apparent during sustained engagements that revealed the practical implications of ammunition abundance versus scarcity. When Marine positions came under attack, the standard defensive doctrine called for coordinated fires that combined rifle fire, automatic weapons, mortars, and artillery into integrated defensive barrages. Machine gunners could maintain sustained fire without concern for ammunition expenditure because supply parties ensured fresh belts reached them within minutes of request. Mortar crews fired illumination rounds throughout the night to deny Japanese forces the cover of darkness, a tactic that would have been impossible without abundant ammunition reserves. Japanese tactical doctrine had evolved around different constraints. Infantry attacks emphasized close combat with bayonets and grenades, reducing reliance on rifle ammunition. Machine guns were positioned for maximum effectiveness, but fired in short, controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. Artillery support remained minimal because shells were too valuable to expend on targets that might be neutralized through infantry assault. These tactical choices reflected not preferences but necessities imposed by logistics limitations that grew worse with each passing week. The ammunition consumption rates that American forces sustained as routine operations would have exhausted Japanese supplies within days. A Marine company defending a section of perimeter might fire 5,000 rounds in a single night repelling infiltration attempts. The next morning, supply parties would deliver fresh ammunition that restored depleted stocks to full levels. Japanese units conducting similar defensive operations rationed their fire, accepting that some American advances would go unchallenged because no ammunition remained to contest them effectively. Eugene Sledge described the psychological impact of unlimited ammunition in terms that revealed its importance beyond pure military effectiveness. Marines who knew they possessed abundant ammunition fought with confidence that translated into tactical aggressiveness. They could suppress enemy positions without calculating whether sufficient rounds remained for subsequent engagements. They maintained higher rates of fire during combat because no sergeant was rationing bullets for future battles. The knowledge that ammunition logistics functioned reliably allowed them to focus entirely on tactical problems without the distraction of resource management. Japanese soldiers faced opposite psychological pressures. Nakamura's orders to his men emphasized ammunition conservation as the highest priority. Each soldier counted his remaining rounds and calculated whether he possessed enough bullets to survive the next American assault. Riflemen who emptied their weapons during combat searches for additional ammunition from casualties, creating dangerous situations where living soldiers exposed themselves while scavenging supplies from the dead. The disparity extended beyond small arms into weapons systems that shaped tactical possibilities. American forces possessed Browning M1919 machine guns that fired 500 rounds per minute. Gun crews received ammunition in linked belts containing 250 rounds each, with multiple belts stored at each gun position. The tactical manual for machine gun employment assumed continuous fire during defensive operations, with pauses only to allow barrels to cool. This doctrine worked because ammunition logistics ensured fresh belts arrived faster than guns could fire them. Japanese forces relied on Type 92 heavy machine guns chambered in 7.7 mm. The weapons themselves were reliable and effective, comparable in performance to American designs. However, Japanese machine gun doctrine emphasized controlled fire that conserved ammunition through disciplined burst discipline. Gun crews received ammunition in 30-round strips that required manual reloading between bursts, a tactical limitation imposed by logistics constraints rather than technical capability. The cumulative effect of these differences became visible during large-scale combat operations. The Battle of Edson's Ridge in September 1942 demonstrated how ammunition supply translated into tactical dominance. Marine positions defending the ridge received continuous ammunition resupply throughout the night as Japanese forces launched repeated assaults. American machine guns maintained sustained fire that created interlocking fields of fire across the entire defensive front. Mortar crews fired illumination and high-explosive rounds without rationing, keeping attacking Japanese forces constantly exposed and disrupted. Japanese forces attacking those positions had departed their assembly areas with approximately 200 rounds per rifleman and 2,000 rounds per machine gun. The ammunition load allowed for one major assault, maybe two if resupply arrived during the battle. When those initial stocks were exhausted through hours of combat, Japanese commanders faced impossible choices: continue the attack with depleted ammunition and risk annihilation, or withdraw and accept tactical failure. Neither option changed the underlying reality that Japanese logistics could not sustain the consumption rates required for victory. The logistics crisis that strangled Japanese operations on Guadalcanal extended far beyond small arms ammunition. Artillery shells represented even more severe constraints because each shell required more industrial capacity to produce and more shipping space to deliver. American artillery batteries supporting Marine positions received regular shipments of 75 mm and 105 mm shells. Forward observers could request fire missions without regard for ammunition conservation, knowing that battalion fire direction centers possessed sufficient stocks to support sustained operations. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal operated under completely different circumstances. The few artillery pieces that had been successfully landed possessed limited ammunition supplies that made extended fire missions impossible. Battery commanders received orders to engage only high-value targets where individual shells might achieve decisive results. American supply dumps, command posts, and landing areas occasionally received Japanese artillery fire, but the frequency and intensity remained far below levels necessary to significantly disrupt operations. The disparity in artillery support created cascading tactical advantages for American forces. Marine infantry advancing against Japanese positions could request artillery preparation fires that softened defensive positions before assault forces closed. Japanese infantry attacking marine positions enjoyed no comparable support, making their assaults far more costly in terms of casualties relative to ground gained. Over time, these cumulative advantages transformed what might have been evenly matched tactical situations into predictable American victories, determined more by logistics than skill or courage. Naval gunfire provided another dimension of fire support that Japanese forces could observe but not counter. American destroyers and cruisers stationed offshore possessed magazines filled with 5-inch and 6-inch shells. Shore fire control parties directed these vessels against Japanese positions, adding tremendous additional firepower to land-based artillery. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction. Japanese soldiers endured bombardments that lasted hours, creating constant stress and preventing rest or organization of effective counterattacks. Japanese naval forces lacked comparable ability to provide sustained fire support for their ground forces. The Tokyo Express destroyer runs prioritized speed over shore bombardment capability. Japanese cruisers that did attempt to shell marine positions faced American air attacks that made extended operations near Guadalcanal suicidally dangerous. The result was sporadic, brief shelling that annoyed rather than neutralized American positions, while Japanese ground forces received no effective naval support. By late October 1942, the ammunition situation had created strategic realities that no amount of Japanese tactical skill could overcome. American forces on Guadalcanal possessed reserves that allowed them to sustain operations indefinitely. Ships continued arriving with fresh stocks. Supply parties distributed ammunition to forward positions on regular schedules. Marines who expended their basic loads during combat received immediate resupply that restored them to full combat effectiveness within hours. Japanese forces existed in a state of permanent scarcity. Nakamura's battalion had been reduced to fewer than 10 rounds per rifleman. His machine guns possessed insufficient ammunition for sustained defensive fires. Requests for resupply generated responses that promised future deliveries without specifying when those deliveries might arrive. The Tokyo Express continued running troops to Guadalcanal, but ships carrying ammunition and supplies were increasingly being sunk by American air and naval forces that dominated the waters around the Solomons. The tactical implications became clear during American offensive operations that commenced in late October. Marine battalions advanced with the confidence of forces that knew logistics supported aggressive action. When they encountered Japanese defensive positions, they called for artillery support and suppressed enemy positions with sustained rifle and machine gun fire. Japanese defenders returned fire with the discipline of soldiers rationing their last ammunition, creating situations where American suppressive fires neutralized positions that might have been formidable had defenders possessed unlimited bullets. Eugene Sledge participated in these advances and recorded observations that revealed the human dimensions of logistics dominance. Japanese positions, when captured, often contained evidence of extreme ammunition scarcity. Empty cartridge casings had been carefully collected for potential reloading if powder and primers became available. Rifle ammunition had been redistributed from casualties to living soldiers, creating makeshift supply chains that barely functioned. Some positions had been abandoned, not because of casualties, but because defenders possessed no ammunition to continue fighting. The material evidence of American abundance contrasted sharply with Japanese deprivation. Captured American positions, when Japanese forces temporarily seized them, revealed ammunition dumps that Japanese soldiers viewed with amazement. Wooden crates stacked 6 feet high, each containing hundreds of rounds. Machine gun belts stored in metal cans that preserved them against tropical humidity. Mortar shells arranged in ready racks that suggested no concern for supply constraints. Japanese soldiers who had been rationing 10 bullets suddenly stood surrounded by thousands of rounds they could not possibly carry back to their own positions. These discoveries created psychological impacts that extended beyond immediate tactical situations. Japanese soldiers understood that they fought an enemy whose industrial capacity could deliver unlimited ammunition, while their own forces starved for basic supplies. The knowledge affected morale in ways that tactical training could not address. Soldiers who faced American positions knew their opponents could fire freely, while they conserved every round created combat stress that accumulated over weeks of sustained operations. By November 1942, the ammunition disparity had contributed to Japanese strategic failures that would determine the outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign. Every Japanese attack had been launched with inadequate ammunition support. Every defensive position had been forced to ration fire, allowing American forces to advance more easily than tactical skill would have permitted. The cumulative effect was measured in casualty rates that demonstrated how logistics determined battlefield outcomes as decisively as tactics or courage. The broader implications extended far beyond Guadalcanal to encompass fundamental questions about industrial warfare in the modern era. American ammunition logistics represented the culmination of industrial capacity that could sustain military operations across global distances. Japanese logistics reflected limitations that no amount of tactical excellence could overcome when fighting enemies whose factories outproduced Japanese industry by factors of 10 or more in critical categories like ammunition production. The industrial foundations of American ammunition superiority began not on Pacific battlefields, but in factory complexes scattered across the American Midwest. Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri represented the largest small arms ammunition facility ever constructed, covering nearly 4,000 acres. When production reached peak capacity in 1943, Lake City's assembly lines produced 30 million rounds per month. This single facility outproduced the entire Japanese small arms ammunition industry by a factor that military planners in Tokyo found difficult to comprehend. The scale of American ammunition production reflected mobilization decisions made years before Pearl Harbor. When European war broke out in 1939, American military planners began calculating requirements for potential global conflict. Their projections assumed ammunition consumption rates that peacetime production could never meet. The solution required building entirely new facilities designed specifically for wartime mass production. Lake City was among the first, groundbreaking occurring in September 1940, more than a year before American combat involvement. By the time Marines landed on Guadalcanal, the facility had been producing ammunition at full capacity for months, creating stockpiles that fed the logistics pipeline. The production process reflected American manufacturing philosophy that emphasized standardization and mass production over craft traditions. Each cartridge moved through automated assembly lines, where specialized machinery performed individual operations with precision that human workers could not match. Primer, insertion, powder charging, bullet seating, and final inspection occurred at speeds measured in units per minute rather than per hour. Quality control systems tested random samples to ensure that ammunition functioned reliably under combat conditions, rejecting entire production batches if defects exceeded acceptable thresholds. Japanese ammunition production operated under entirely different constraints that reflected both industrial capacity limitations and strategic miscalculations. Smaller facilities located primarily on home islands lacked the automated equipment that made American mass production possible. More production steps required skilled manual labor, limiting output while increasing costs. Raw material shortages further constrained production as American submarines severed shipping lanes that delivered copper, lead, and chemicals from occupied territories. Japan's domestic sources of these materials were insufficient for wartime demands, creating bottlenecks that limited ammunition output regardless of how efficiently existing facilities operated. Japanese industry produced approximately 1 billion rounds of small arms ammunition annually at peak capacity, compared to American production that exceeded 10 billion rounds per year. The 10-to-1 disparity meant that even if Japanese logistics had functioned perfectly, their forces would have remained outnumbered in the ammunition supplies available per soldier. Japanese military planners had never anticipated fighting campaigns that would consume ammunition at Pacific war rates. Their pre-war calculations assumed conflicts similar to operations in China, where ammunition expenditure remained relatively low and logistics chains operated over land routes rather than across ocean distances measured in thousands of miles. Transportation systems that delivered ammunition from factories to combat zones represented another dimension of American logistical superiority. The United States possessed rail networks that connected manufacturing centers to ports on both coasts. Ammunition produced in Missouri reached San Francisco within days, where it was loaded aboard merchant vessels for transport across the Pacific. Port facilities in places like Oakland and San Pedro handled ammunition loading operations that moved thousands of tons per day through systems designed specifically for military logistics. The Liberty Ship program demonstrated American industrial capacity applied to the maritime transportation problem. These standardized cargo vessels could be constructed in shipyards from prefabricated components in fewer than 50 days from keel laying to launch. By 1943, American shipyards were delivering 3 Liberty ships per day, creating merchant marine capacity that replaced losses to Japanese submarines while continuously expanding the total tonnage available for Pacific logistics. Japanese merchant shipping faced opposite trajectories. Pre-war merchant fleet, numbered approximately 6 million tons, considered adequate for peacetime commerce, but insufficient for sustained military operations across the vast Pacific. American submarines began targeting Japanese merchant shipping immediately after Pearl Harbor, sinking vessels faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. By 1943, available shipping had declined to levels that created impossible choices between delivering troops, ammunition, food, and fuel to isolated island garrisons. The logistics network supporting American forces on Guadalcanal included intermediate supply bases that buffered frontline forces from disruptions. Espiritu Santo and Noumea served as major transshipment points where supplies from the continental United States were consolidated and redistributed to forward areas. These bases maintained ammunition reserves measured in months rather than days, creating deep logistics buffers that ensured temporary disruptions never translated into actual shortages at the fighting front. Japanese logistics lacked comparable intermediate bases in the southern Pacific. Rabaul served as the primary Japanese base, but its distance from Guadalcanal and exposure to American air attacks made it vulnerable. Supplies accumulated at Rabaul had to be moved to Guadalcanal by fast destroyer runs that could carry only limited tonnage. The result was a logistics system operating at maximum capacity just to deliver minimum requirements, with no reserves to absorb disruptions or support surge operations. The November 1942 Japanese offensive to recapture Henderson Field demonstrated how ammunition shortages constrained tactical options, regardless of troop strength. Japanese commanders assembled approximately 15,000 troops for coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The plan required sustained combat over several days, with continuous pressure forcing American defenders to deplete their own ammunition stocks, while Japanese forces advanced through concentrated assaults. The operation failed primarily due to ammunition logistics rather than tactical execution. Japanese artillery could provide only minimal preparatory fires before infantry assaults. Machine gun crews conserved ammunition during suppressive fire missions, allowing American positions to return effective fire. Rifle ammunition ran short among assault battalions before they could exploit initial successes, forcing units to halt advances and consolidate gains rather than pushing through to objectives. By the battle's conclusion, many Japanese infantry were reduced to fewer than 5 rounds per weapon, making further operations impossible. American defenders fought the same battle with completely different logistics realities. Ammunition resupply operations continued throughout the fighting, delivering fresh stocks to forward positions even during active combat. Artillery batteries fired thousands of shells in support of defensive positions. Machine gunners maintained sustained fire that broke up Japanese assaults before they could close with defensive lines. When the battle ended, American ammunition stocks had been reduced but remained sufficient for sustained operations, while Japanese forces were combat ineffective due to ammunition exhaustion. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Yoshio Nakamura survived the November offensive, but commanded a battalion that no longer functioned as an effective military unit. His surviving soldiers possessed fewer than 10 rounds per rifleman. Machine guns had been rendered useless by lack of ammunition. The battalion's single remaining mortar had fired its last shell during the failed offensive. Requests for resupply generated promises but no actual deliveries. The Tokyo Express had been redirected to other operations. Supply ships attempting to reach Guadalcanal during daylight were being sunk by American aircraft operating from Henderson Field. The final weeks of Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal became a study in gradual logistical strangulation. Japanese forces still occupied defensive positions and maintained unit organization, but their ability to influence tactical situations declined daily as ammunition stocks approached zero. American patrols encountered Japanese positions that did not return fire because defenders possessed no ammunition. Defensive lines that should have been contested were abandoned because units lacked the means to resist even limited American advances. Japanese soldiers adapted to ammunition scarcity through measures that revealed desperation rather than tactical innovation. Ammunition was redistributed from units in quiet sectors to those facing immediate American pressure, creating a shell game that concentrated scarcity rather than eliminating it. Individual soldiers manufactured crude expedients, like sharpened bamboo stakes and pit traps, reverting to weapons that required no industrial support. Some units attempted nighttime raids on American positions with the explicit goal of capturing ammunition, a tactic that rarely succeeded and often resulted in casualties that further depleted already weakened forces. American intelligence officers studying captured Japanese documents discovered the depth of the logistics crisis through mundane military paperwork. Ammunition status reports showed catastrophic shortages across all weapon types. Requests for resupply detailed exactly how many rounds each unit required to continue operations. Higher headquarters responses acknowledged these requests, but offered no firm delivery dates, suggesting that Japanese Logistics Command understood the situation was unsustainable, but lacked means to address it. Eugene Sledge and other Marines observed the deteriorating Japanese position through evidence that accumulated with each patrol and engagement. Captured positions contained cartridge casings that had been collected for potential reuse. Japanese casualties were found carrying fewer than 5 rounds of ammunition. Some positions showed evidence of ammunition rationing so severe that defenders appeared to have fired no shots before being overrun. The material evidence painted a picture of an army that had ceased to function as a modern military force due to complete logistics failure. The ammunition crisis was symptomatic of broader Japanese logistics failures that encompassed food, medicine, and equipment. However, ammunition held special psychological significance because its absence directly prevented military action. Soldiers could endure hunger, disease, and equipment shortages, while still maintaining the theoretical capacity to fight. Without ammunition, they became armed only with weapons that had been reduced to clubs. The psychological impact of this powerlessness affected morale in ways that contributed to the eventual Japanese decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. By December 1942, Japanese strategic planning recognized that Guadalcanal could not be held with available logistics support. The decision to evacuate represented not tactical failure, but acknowledgement that no amount of tactical skill or soldier courage could overcome the fundamental disparity in ammunition supply. The evacuation operation that commenced in February 1943 extracted surviving Japanese troops, but left behind equipment and positions that American forces occupied without significant resistance. The broader Pacific campaign validated lessons learned on Guadalcanal regarding the decisive importance of ammunition logistics. Subsequent American operations at Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa all featured ammunition logistics systems that ensured Marines and soldiers possessed unlimited fire support. Japanese defenders at these islands faced gradually worsening ammunition shortages as American naval and air dominance made resupply increasingly impossible. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945 demonstrated the ultimate expression of American ammunition logistics applied to the Pacific Island warfare. Prior to the landing, American naval forces and aircraft delivered the most concentrated bombardment of the Pacific War. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired tens of thousands of shells at Japanese positions over 3 consecutive days. Carrier aircraft dropped hundreds of tons of bombs in coordinated strikes that targeted known defensive installations. The preliminary bombardment consumed more ammunition than many previous Pacific campaigns had used in their entirety, representing a level of material expenditure that Japanese forces could only have dreamed of matching. The bombardment's intensity reflected American confidence that ammunition supplies were effectively unlimited. Battery commanders received orders to fire at will against any suspected Japanese position. Spotter aircraft directed naval gunfire onto targets that previous doctrine would have considered too minor to justify shell expenditure. The entire operation demonstrated that American ammunition logistics had reached a level of abundance where cost-benefit calculations that constrained earlier operations no longer applied. If unlimited ammunition could save American lives by suppressing Japanese defenses, then unlimited ammunition would be expended without hesitation or concern for supply constraints. When Marines landed on Iwo Jima's beaches, they brought with them ammunition logistics systems refined through 3 years of Pacific operations. Each rifle company possessed organic ammunition stocks sufficient for extended operations. Battalion and regimental supply points were established within hours of landing. Shore parties efficiently moved ammunition from landing craft to forward positions. The system functioned so smoothly that frontline Marines rarely experienced ammunition shortages despite combat intensity that exceeded Guadalcanal by orders of magnitude. Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima had prepared for the American assault by accumulating ammunition stocks far larger than those available on Guadalcanal. Months of relative quiet had allowed resupply ships to reach the island and build reserves. Japanese commanders understood that once fighting commenced, no further resupply would be possible. They planned accordingly by stockpiling ammunition in underground magazines connected to defensive positions through tunnel systems. Despite these preparations, Japanese ammunition logistics on Iwo Jima ultimately failed for the same reasons that had doomed Guadalcanal. American forces fired ammunition faster than Japanese industry could produce it. The cumulative disparity in fire support meant that American advances faced opposition that gradually weakened as Japanese stocks were depleted. Forward Japanese positions ran out of ammunition first, allowing American forces to penetrate defensive lines. Interior positions held out longer, but eventually succumbed when their ammunition was exhausted. The final Japanese resistance occurred in situations where defenders possessed weapons but no bullets, making their resistance symbolic rather than militarily effective. The statistics from Iwo Jima illustrated the scale of American ammunition expenditure in stark terms. Marine and Army forces on the island fired approximately 45,000 tons of artillery and mortar ammunition during 36 days of combat. This figure exceeded the total ammunition production of the Japanese home islands during some months of the war. Small arms ammunition consumption reached proportions that would have supplied multiple Japanese divisions for months of operations. The disparity was not merely quantitative but qualitative, representing industrial capacity differences that determined strategic outcomes before tactical operations commenced. The ammunition question extended beyond ground combat into naval and air warfare domains, where disparities were even more pronounced. American aircraft carriers operated with magazines filled with thousands of bombs, torpedoes, and rockets. Carrier air groups could launch multiple strikes per day against Japanese positions without concern that ordnance supplies would be exhausted. When magazines ran low, replenishment ships delivered fresh stocks at sea, eliminating the need to return to port for resupply. Japanese carriers and aircraft operated under completely different limitations. Ordnance stocks were limited by what could be carried aboard ship, with no possibility of underway replenishment. After depleting magazines through several strikes, carriers had to withdraw from operations to rearm at shore bases. This limitation affected tactical flexibility and made sustained carrier operations impossible. American carriers could remain on station for weeks. Japanese carriers measured their operational endurance in days. The cumulative effect of ammunition logistics disparities created strategic realities that shaped the entire Pacific War. American forces planned operations, assuming unlimited ammunition support would be available. Japanese forces planned operations attempting to work around ammunition scarcity that could not be eliminated through tactical innovation. Over time, these different planning assumptions created combat situations where American material superiority determined outcomes more decisively than tactical skill or courage on either side. The human cost of logistics failure fell most heavily on Japanese soldiers who fought with professionalism and courage while lacking the material support necessary for success. Yoshio Nakamura and thousands like him executed orders to attack American positions while knowing their ammunition supplies were inadequate. They defended positions against American assaults while rationing bullets that should have been fired freely. They endured artillery bombardments without ability to respond effectively due to ammunition shortages their tactical skills could not overcome. Eugene Sledge and his fellow Marines benefited from logistics systems they rarely thought about, except when observing Japanese positions that revealed evidence of extreme ammunition scarcity. The unlimited ammunition that seemed normal to American forces represented industrial capacity, advantages that determined strategic outcomes as decisively as any tactical innovation. The confidence that came from knowing supplies would always be available translated into tactical aggressiveness that Japanese forces could observe but not match. The post-war analysis of Pacific logistics revealed details that contemporary participants could only partially understand. American ammunition production exceeded 27 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during the war years. Japanese production remained below 5 billion rounds total. American artillery shell production reached approximately 500 million rounds. Japanese production barely exceeded 60 million rounds. These were not marginal differences but order of magnitude disparities that made Japanese defeat inevitable once American industrial mobilization reached full capacity. The ammunition supply story from Guadalcanal to Okinawa demonstrated fundamental truths about modern warfare that would influence military planning for generations. Industrial capacity matters more than individual soldier quality when conflicts extend over years rather than weeks. Logistics systems that can sustain continuous operations provide decisive advantages over opponents who must husband scarce resources. The ability to deliver unlimited ammunition to fighting forces creates tactical options that no amount of skill can match when opponents lack comparable support. For Japanese soldiers who survived the Pacific War, the memories of fighting while chronically short of ammunition remained among their most bitter recollections. They had trained as professional soldiers, mastered tactics and weapons, and faced combat with courage that American opponents acknowledged. Yet they had been defeated not primarily through tactical failures but through logistics inadequacies they could observe but not correct. American forces possessed unlimited ammunition that allowed them to fight without constraint, while Japanese forces rationed every round, creating combat conditions that made tactical skill secondary to material abundance. The final assessment of the Pacific ammunition situation reveals that wars are won not only by soldiers who fight, but by industrial systems that sustain their ability to continue fighting. American ammunition logistics represented the triumph of industrial capacity over tactical excellence, proving that modern warfare requires factory output as much as battlefield courage. Japanese forces learned this lesson through years of combat, where their skills were rendered insufficient by lack of ammunition that no tactical innovation could replace. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.